April 26, 1986. 1:23 in the morning. Inside a Soviet nuclear power plant, engineers were preparing for what was supposed to be a routine safety test. The test had been planned for weeks. Everything seemed completely normal. But in the next 30 seconds, the reactor would explode, and the world would change forever. To understand what happened, we first need to understand how a nuclear reactor works. Inside the reactor core are uranium fuel rods. These fuel rods produce enormous heat. That heat boils water. The boiling water turns into steam. The steam spins a giant turbine. The turbine powers a generator, and that generator produces electricity that flows into the power grid. But a nuclear reactor must stay cool at all times. Cooling pumps constantly circulate water through the reactor. If the cooling stops, the reactor temperature rises rapidly. Engineers wanted to test a dangerous scenario. What would happen if the plant suddenly lost power? If electricity stopped, the cooling pumps would stop. Without cooling, the reactor could quickly overheat. But there was a backup system. When power fails, the spinning turbine can continue generating electricity. For a short time, just long enough to keep the cooling pumps running, until the diesel generators start. To run the test, the engineers first had to lower the reactor power. But something went wrong. The power dropped too low. The reactor became unstable. A gas called xenon began building up inside the reactor. Xenon slows the nuclear reaction. The reactor was essentially choking. At that moment, the test should have been canceled. But the engineers kept going. At 1:23 in the morning, the safety test finally began. Steam flowing to the turbine was reduced. The turbine began slowing down. As the turbine slowed, the cooling pumps also began losing power. Water circulation inside the reactor started decreasing. Inside the reactor core, heat began rising rapidly. Pressure started building inside the reactor channels. The reactor was becoming dangerously unstable. Control room alarms began flashing. The operators realized something was wrong. Suddenly, the reactor power surged. The output began climbing rapidly. The reactor was now out of control. An operator reached for the emergency shutdown. This button was designed to stop the nuclear reaction instantly. The operator pressed the AZ5 button. Control rods began descending into the reactor, but the reactor had a dangerous design flaw. The control rods had graphite tips. For a brief moment, those graphite tips actually increased the nuclear reaction. Power spiked even higher. Fuel channels began rupturing. Superheated steam burst through the reactor. A massive explosion tore open the reactor building. The reactor core was now exposed. Burning graphite was thrown across the roof. Fires started spreading across the reactor building. But something far worse could still happen. The nuclear fuel was still extremely hot. Below the reactor were massive water tanks. If molten fuel reached that water, it could trigger another massive explosion. An explosion that could devastate the entire region. Firefighters rushed toward the burning reactor. They began spraying water across the roof. Every second now mattered. The fires had to be stopped immediately. If the flames reached deeper into the reactor, another explosion could occur. But the firefighters kept spraying water. Slowly, the flames began shrinking. One by one, the fires started going out. The worst catastrophe was avoided. But many firefighters received deadly doses of radiation. Their actions prevented a much larger disaster. 30 seconds. 30 seconds that helped save millions of lives. 30 seconds that changed history.